Part 2. When in consequence of a long chronic illness the condition of the patient is examined, the question may arise whether the weakening of the fibers and the debility of the organs are the cause of the maladies continuing or the effect of the bad treatment that prolongs its action. The attending physician attributes the entire failure of his skill to the poor constitution of the patient, to the climate, to the surroundings, and so on. On the other hand, the patient attributes the aggravation of the evil to the system of treatment followed. Only the common crowd, the inquisitive populace, shakes its head and cannot reach a decision. Something like this happens in the case of the Philippines. Instead of physician, red government, that is, friars, employees, etc. Instead of patient, Philippines, instead of malady, indolence. And, just as happens in similar cases, then the patient gets worse, everybody loses his head, each one dodges the responsibility to place it upon somebody else, and instead of seeking the causes in order to combat the evil in them, devotes himself at best to attacking the symptoms, here a bloodletting, a tax, there a plaster, forced labor, further on a sedative, a trifling reform. Every new arrival proposes a new remedy, one, seasons of prayer, the relics of a saint, the viaticum, the friars, another, a shower bath, still another, with pretensions to modern ideas, a transfusion of blood. It's nothing, only the patient has 8 million indolent red corpuscles, some few white corpuscles in the form of an agricultural colony will get us out of the trouble. So, on all sides there are groans, gnawing of lips, clenching of fists, many hollow words, great ignorance, a deal of talk, a lot of fear. The patient is near his finish. Yes, transfusion of blood, transfusion of blood. New life, new vitality. Yes, the new white corpuscles that you are going to inject into its veins, the new white corpuscles that were a cancer in another organism will withstand all the depravity of the system, will withstand the bloodlettings that it suffers every day, will have more stamina than all the 8 million red corpuscles, will cure all the disorders, all the degeneration, all the trouble in the principal organs. Be thankful if they do not become coagulations and produce gangrene, be thankful if they do not reproduce the cancer. While the patient breathes, we must not lose hope, and however late we be, a judicious examination is never superfluous, at least the cause of death may be known. We are not trying to put all the blame on the physician, and still less on the patient, for we have already spoken of a predisposition due to the climate, a reasonable and natural predisposition, in the absence of which the race would disappear, sacrificed to excessive labor in a tropical country. Indolence in the Philippines is a chronic malady, but not a hereditary one. The Filipinos have not always been what they are, witnesses whereto are all the historians of the first years after the discovery of the islands. Before the arrival of the Europeans, the Malayan Filipinos carried on an active trade, not only among themselves but also with all the neighboring countries. A Chinese manuscript of the 13th century, translated by Dr. Hirth, which we will take up at another time, speaks of China's relations with the islands, relations purely commercial, in which mention is made of the activity and honesty of the traders of Luzon, who took the Chinese products and distributed them throughout all the islands, traveling for 9 months, and then returned to pay religiously even for the merchandise that the Chinamen did not remember to have given them. The products which they in exchange exported from the islands were crude wax, cotton, pearls, tortoise shell, betel nuts, dry goods, etc. The first thing noticed by Pigafetta, who came with Magellan in 1521, on arriving at the first island of the Philippines, Samar, was the courtesy and kindness of the inhabitants and their commerce. To honor our captain, he says, they conducted him to their boats where they had their merchandise, which consisted of cloves, cinnamon, pepper, nutmegs, mace, gold and other things, and they made us understand by gestures that such articles were to be found in the islands to which we were going. Further on he speaks of the vessels and utensils of solid gold that he found in Butuan, where the people worked mines. He describes the silk dresses, the daggers with long gold hilts and scabbards of carved wood, the gold sets of teeth, etc. Among cereals and fruits he mentions rice, millet, oranges, lemons, panicum, etc. That the islands maintained relations with neighboring countries and even with distant ones is proven by the ships from Siam, laden with gold and slaves, that Magellan found in Cebu. These ships paid certain duties to the king of the island. In the same year, 1521, the survivors of Magellan's expedition met the son of the Raja of Luzon, who, as Captain General of the Sultan of Borneo and Admiral of his fleet, had conquered for him the great city of Lave. Might this captain, who was greatly feared by all his foes, have been the Raja Mat Anda whom the Spaniards afterwards encountered in Tonda in 1570? In 1539 the warriors of Luzon took part in the formidable contests of Sumatra, and under the orders of Anji Sairi Timur, Raja of Bada, conquered and overthrew the terrible Alcidin, Sultan of Achin, renowned in the historical annals of the Far East. At that time, that sea where float the islands like a set of emeralds on a pattern of bright glass, that sea was everywhere traversed by junks, paraus, barongays, vintas, vessels swift as shuttles, so large that they could maintain 100 rowers on a side. That sea bore everywhere commerce, industry, agriculture, by the force of the oars moved to the sound of warlike songs of the genealogies and achievements of the Philippine divinities. Wealth abounded in the islands. Pigafetta tells us of the abundance of foodstuffs in Paragua and of its inhabitants, who nearly all tilled their own fields. At this island the survivors of Magellan's expedition were well received and provisioned. A little later, these same survivors captured a vessel, plundered and sacked it, and took prisoner in it the chief of the island of Paragua with his son and brother. In this same vessel they captured bronze lumbards, and this is the first mention of artillery of the Filipinos, for these lumbards were useful to the chief of Paragua against the savages of the interior. They let him ransom himself within 7 days, demanding 400 measures of rice, 20 pigs, 20 goats, and 450 chickens. This is the first act of piracy recorded in Philippine history. The chief of Paragua paid everything, and moreover voluntarily added coconuts, bananas, and sugar-cane jars filled with palm wine. When Caesar was taken prisoner by the corsairs and required to pay 25 talents ransom, he replied, "I'll give you 50, but later I'll have you all crucified." The chief of Paragua was more generous, he forgot. His conduct, while it may reveal weakness, also demonstrates that the islands were abundantly provisioned. This chief was named Tuan Mahamad, his brother, Guantal, and his son, Tuan Maham. A very extraordinary thing, and one that shows the facility with which the natives learned Spanish, is that 50 years before the arrival of the Spaniards in Luzon, in that very year 1521 when they first came to the islands, there were already natives of Luzon who understood Castilian. In the treaties of peace that the survivors of Magellan's expedition made with the chief of Paragua, when the servant interpreter died they communicated with one another through a Moro who had been captured in the island of the king of Luzon and who understood some Spanish. Where did this extemporaneous interpreter learn Castilian? In the Moluccas? In Malacca, with the Portuguese? Spaniards did not reach Luzon until 1571. Legazpi's expedition met in Butuan various traders of Luzon with their boats laden with iron, wax cloths, porcelain, etc. Plenty of provisions, activity, trade, movement in all the southern islands. They arrive at the island of Cebu, abounding in provisions, with mines and washings of gold, and peopled with natives, as Morga says, very populous, and at a port frequented by many ships that came from the islands and kingdoms near India, as Collins says, and even though they were peacefully received, discord soon arose. The city was taken by force and burned. The fire destroyed the food supplies, and naturally famine broke out in that town of 100,000 people, as the historians say, and among the members of the expedition, but the neighboring islands quickly relieved the need, thanks to the abundance they enjoyed. All the histories of those first years, in short, abound in long accounts about the industry and agriculture of the natives, mines, gold washings, looms, farms, barter, naval construction, raising of poultry and stock, weaving of silk and cotton, distilleries, manufactures of arms, pearl fisheries, the civet industry, the horn and hide industry, etc., are things encountered at every step, and, considering the time and the conditions in the islands, prove that there was life, there was activity, there was movement. And if this, which is deduction, does not convince any minds imbued with unfair prejudices, perhaps of some avail may be the testimony of the oft-quoted Dr. Morga, who was Lieutenant Governor of Manila for 7 years and after rendering great service in the archipelago was appointed criminal judge of the Audiencia of Mexico and counselor of the Inquisition. His testimony, we say, is highly credible, not only because all his contemporaries have spoken of him in terms that border on veneration, but also because his work, from which we take these citations, is written with great circumspection and care, as well with reference to the authorities in the Philippines as to the errors they committed. The natives, says Morga, in Chapter 7, speaking of the occupations of the Chinese, are very far from exercising those trades and have even forgotten much about farming, raising poultry, stock and cotton, and weaving cloth as they used to do in their paganism and for a long time after the country was conquered. The whole of Chapter 8 of his work deals with this moribund activity, this much forgotten industry, and yet in spite of that, how long is his 8th chapter? And not only Morga, not only Chirino, Collin, Argensola, Gaspar de San Agustin and others agree in this matter, but modern travelers, after 250 years, examining the decadence and misery, assert the same thing. Dr. Hans Meyer, when he saw the unsubdued tribes cultivating beautiful fields and working energetically, asked if they would not become indolent when they in turn should accept Christianity and a paternal government. Accordingly, the Filipinos, in spite of the climate, in spite of their few needs, that they were less than now, were not the indolent creatures of our time, and, as we shall see later on, their ethics and their mode of life were not what is now complacently attributed to them. How then, and in what way, was that active and enterprising infidel native of ancient times converted into the lazy and indolent Christian, as our contemporary writers say? We have already spoken of the more or less latent predisposition which exists in the Philippines toward indolence, and which must exist everywhere, in the whole world, in all men, because we all hate work more or less, as it may be more or less hard, more or less unproductive. The dolce far niente of the Italian, the rascars la barriga of the Spaniard, the supreme aspiration of the bourgeois to live on his income in peace and tranquility, attest this. What causes operated to awake this terrible predisposition from its lethargy? How is it that the Filipino people, so fond of its customs as to border on routine, has given up its ancient habits of work, of trade, of navigation, etc., even to the extent of completely forgetting its past?